My name is Mark, and I'm a detective in a small town. Our community has always been peaceful, where everyone knew each other, but lately the atmosphere has changed. The disappearance of Jennifer Williams became a turning point, causing panic and fear. This young woman who disappeared during an evening jog in the park was the first of a series of disappearances that caught my attention. In the morning, I sat in my office, flipping through photos from the scene. I've seen a lot of terrible things in recent years, but something about this case really stuck with me. Photos of Jennifer were the last memory I had of her smile now looking ominous. The thought did not leave my mind that I was missing something, some little thing that could be decisive in the investigation. I decided to personally inspect the park one more time. It was early, and only a few people were jogging or walking their dogs. I walked around the area around the fountain where Jennifer was last seen. Something shiny in the grass caught my eye. It was a small locket, similar to the one Jennifer was wearing in one of the photos. The locket was opened, and inside was a small photo of Jennifer with her dog. This hint could be decisive. Finding the medallion gave a new impetus to the case. I decided to visit the nearest bar where Jennifer often spent her evenings. Maybe someone saw her that night before she disappeared. The bartender, Joe, was a friendly guy and seemed to remember all his customers. "Yes, I remember Jennifer," he said, wiping his glasses. "She was here that night. She was sitting at the bar talking to some guy, tall, dark-haired, kind of athletic." This information was important. A tall, dark-haired man. But who was he? When I got back to the station, I started going through the surveillance cameras near the bar. Finding the right time, I saw Jennifer leaving the bar with the man. They were talking and seemed to be having a good time. But then he simply disappeared from the frame, and Jennifer continued on her way. Who is that man? Why did he disappear with her and not reappear? My heart was beating faster. I knew we were on the right track. The next day we got the name. His name was James Harrison, and he was ex-military, but his record was clean. No criminal records. This made me even more suspicious. We decided to invite him for questioning. James was calm and confident. He denied any involvement in Jennifer's disappearance, but something in his behavior alarmed me. Maybe it was his cold smile or the way he avoided direct answers. I decided to continue following him, and one day he led us to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. We waited for him to come out and then went inside. The warehouse was empty, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. On the wall was painted a strange symbology, similar to some kind of cult mark. This was a new twist in the case. Cult symbols? Perhaps we are dealing not only with a maniac, but also with something bigger and scarier. I got home late at night, and when I entered, I felt something was wrong. There were signs of an intrusion in my apartment, but nothing was missing. There was only a note on the table. "Stop, or you will be next." My heart beat even faster. Who could it be? James, or someone else watching my actions? I decided to increase security measures and asked my colleagues to help me in the investigation. We knew we were dealing with a dangerous enemy who was ready to do anything to stop us. The next day, I got a message from James. He wanted to meet in one of the remote cafes on the outskirts of the city. I knew it could be a trap, but I decided to take a chance. Arriving at the place, I saw James at the table, but as soon as I approached him, he got up and quickly left. I ran after him, but he disappeared into the crowd. It was a game of survival, and I knew the next turn was mine. I decided to set a trap for James. We set up surveillance on his house and waited for him to show up. A few hours later, we saw him leaving the house and heading towards the forest on the outskirts of the city. We followed him, trying to remain unnoticed. James led us to an old abandoned house in the woods. We bypassed it and entered inside. There were signs of a struggle inside, and another locket lay on the floor. But it wasn't Jennifer's locket. It was the locket of another victim who had disappeared several months earlier. We began to search the house and found the basement. Opening the door, I saw something terrible. There were photographs of all the missing women as well as their personal belongings. But the worst thing was that there were names and dates written on the walls, and the last date was today. I realized that James was planning another kidnapping. But who? Back at the precinct, we began checking all missing person records that might help us find a connection between the victims. They were all young women with similar features. We also discovered that they were all regulars at the same gym. We decided to talk to the trainer at the gym, and he confirmed that James was also a member of that club. This gave us another clue. We decided to set a trap in the gym. I disguised myself as a regular customer and began training, watching all the suspects. And a few hours later, I saw James. He approached one of the women and started a conversation with her. I decided to follow them. They left the gym and headed for her car. I overheard their conversation. James invited her to dinner, and she accepted. This was my opportunity. I decided to warn her, but I didn't want to scare her. Approaching her, I quietly said, "Be careful with this man. He can be dangerous." That night, I decided to act fast. We tracked James' car and waited for him to leave the restaurant with the woman. As soon as they got into the car, we started following them. They were heading to the same old house in the woods. We were ready to act. Having driven up to the house, we surrounded it and entered inside. James was caught off guard and tried to run away, but we apprehended him. The woman was saved. She was scared, but alive. The investigation continued, and we discovered that James was part of a cult that kidnapped women for their rituals. But the most terrible thing was that this cult was not revealed to the end. We knew that this was only the tip of the iceberg, and the real threat was still ahead. After the arrest of James, we began to investigate his connections and contacts. It turned out that he was only part of a large organization operating throughout the country. We have received information about other members of the cult and their whereabouts. The investigation was gaining momentum, and we knew we were dealing with a very dangerous group. However, despite our efforts, the disappearances continued. The cult seemed to proceed very cautiously, and each new disappearance was carefully planned. We started receiving threatening messages, which made us even more cautious. We knew we had to act fast. The investigation led us to a large estate outside the city where, according to our information, new cult rituals were to take place. We have prepared an operation to arrest all participants. At night, we surrounded the estate and went inside. It was dark, and all we could hear were soft voices from the basement. When we went down there, we saw a group of people in black robes standing around the altar. On the altar lay another young woman who was being prepared for sacrifice. We stopped the ritual and arrested all the participants. The woman was saved, and the cult was defeated. This was our victory, but we knew that this was only the beginning of a great struggle against the evil that lurked in the shadows. After the arrest of the cult members, we thought we had finally stopped the terrible events. But our hopes were dashed when news of another disappearance arrived a few days later. This time, Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who worked at the local library, disappeared. Her disappearance occurred under similar circumstances as in the case of Jennifer. My heart sank with terror and anxiety. I realized that the cult has not been completely defeated, and someone continues their activities. Sarah was the next victim, and we had to act fast to save her. We started an investigation to gather information about Sarah. She was a quiet and modest woman who never got into trouble. She was last seen in the library in the evening when she was closing the premises. Surveillance cameras showed her leaving the building but then disappearing from view. We checked every possible route she could have taken, but there was no trace. I began to feel helpless, but I could not allow myself to give up. We knew that every minute counted. A few days later, we received an anonymous letter. It contained a photograph of Sarah tied to a chair in some dark room. On the back of the photo was written, "You will not be able to save her, like the others." It was a clear threat, and we knew we had to act immediately. We analyzed the photo for any clues as to the location. In the background, an old brick wall and a window with a characteristic lattice could be seen. This was the key to the search. We started checking all possible places with similar characteristics. Finally, our search led us to an old factory on the outskirts of town. This factory has been abandoned for a long time, and its premises corresponded to what was in the photo. We immediately went there, prepared for a possible confrontation. When we drove up to the factory, we saw that the door was open. The courtyard was empty and quiet, which only increased our anxiety. We divided into groups and began to search the premises. As I climbed to the second floor, I heard a faint moan. It was coming from one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. As I got closer, I saw that the door was locked. We broke them and went inside. Sarah was sitting there, tied to a chair. She was exhausted but alive. We quickly freed her and called an ambulance. Sarah said that she was kidnapped by a man in a mask and held captive, preparing for some ritual. While the medics examined Sarah, we began to search the premises, trying to find traces of the kidnapper. We found fresh traces of blood on the wall that led to the back door of the factory. We followed them and saw that they were leading to a nearby forest. We began the pursuit, trying not to lose the tracks. The forest was thick and dark, but we kept moving forward. Suddenly, we heard a sound like a branch breaking. We ran to the sound and saw a man in dark clothes trying to run away. We chased after him, and after a short chase, we managed to catch him. The man was armed with a knife and resisted, but we neutralized him. His face was hidden under a mask, but when we took it off, it turned out to be one of the ones we couldn't identify when the cult members were arrested. He refused to talk, but we knew he was only part of a larger conspiracy. We took him to the station and began questioning him, trying to find out more about the cult and their plans. During the interrogation, we learned that the cult has not been completely destroyed and has its members all over the country. They continue to kidnap young women for their rituals, and Sarah was just one of many victims. We managed to find out the locations of their warehouses and plans for the future. This discovery was shocking, but also gave us new hope. We began coordinating with other law enforcement agencies across the country to stop the cult once and for all, but we knew that the fight was just beginning, and each new clue could be the last. After the rescue operation and interrogation, we received new information about the possible whereabouts of cult members. We decided to act immediately to prevent further abductions and save potential victims. We learned about another woman who was in danger. Her name was Elizabeth, and she worked at a local hospital. We immediately went there to warn her and ensure her safety. Elizabeth was scared but agreed to cooperate with us. We arranged round-the-clock monitoring of Elizabeth and her house. She was our next potential victim, and we couldn't allow another kidnapping. We have deployed our people throughout the area to be ready for any eventuality. A few days later, we noticed a suspicious man stalking Elizabeth's house. He tried to remain unnoticed, but our people discovered him. We decided not to act immediately, but to follow him to learn more about his plans. We followed the suspicious man to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. He went inside, and we decided to wait. After some time, we heard the sounds of struggle. This was our chance. We burst inside and saw a man trying to kidnap Elizabeth. We detained him and saved the woman. She was shocked but grateful for our help. The man turned out to be another member of the cult, and during the interrogation, we learned more about their plans and other victims. With the new data, we began to coordinate our actions with other law enforcement agencies. We learned of a great ritual that was to take place at a secret farm outside the city. This was our chance to stop the cult once and for all. With the new data, we began to coordinate our actions with other law enforcement agencies. We learned of a great ritual that was to take place at a secret farm outside of town. This was our chance to stop the cult once and for all. We have prepared an operation to arrest all participants of the ritual. The night was dark and oppressive when we set out for the farm. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins, making my heart beat faster. This was our most important operation, and we could not afford to make mistakes. Driving up to the farm, we saw a light coming from a large barn. All our instincts told us that we are on the right track. We split into groups and began to sneak into the building. The heart was constricted by fear and anticipation. I was in the group that approached the back entrance. We heard soft voices and strange sounds coming from inside. Having made a sign, we simultaneously broke down the door and broke in. What we saw cannot be described in words. Inside the shed, we saw dozens of people in black robes standing around the altar. In the center lay a young woman tied to a table, screaming in terror. She was still alive, but she looked very exhausted and frightened. We rushed to the altar, trying to free her, but the participants of the ritual began to resist. There was a fight. The people of the cult were armed with knives and sticks. It was a real battlefield. I saw my colleagues fighting the fanatics, defending themselves and trying to save the victim. I managed to break through to the altar and cut the ropes that bound the woman. She fell into my arms, crying and trembling. We quickly took her out of the barn, under the cover of our men. Medics were waiting for her outside the building, ready to provide first aid. When I went back inside, I saw that our people had taken control of the situation. Several fanatics were detained, others tried to escape. We didn't give them a chance. The whole operation lasted several hours, but finally we were able to stop this terrible ritual. When it was over, we were standing on the farm, exhausted and covered in mud and blood. I felt relieved and proud of our team. We did the impossible, stopped another ritual and saved a life. But at the same time, I understood that this was only one battle in a long war. The woman we rescued turned out to be Amanda. She told us the horrific details of what happened to her and other women who were not so lucky. Her testimony was invaluable to our investigation. After the rescue operation, we realized that the cult has many more members than we thought. Amanda talked about several other women who were being held in different places. We immediately began planning new operations to rescue them and apprehend all those involved. It was a constant struggle, but we could not afford to give up. Each new information, each new discovery brought us closer to our goal. We knew that only by joining forces, we could stop this horror once and for all. A few days later, we received new information about the possible location of another victim. She was in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. We went there prepared for the worst. The forest was dark and dense, and every step was a reminder of danger. Approaching the hut, we heard screams. It was a woman. We broke in and saw that she was tied to a chair, and a man with a knife was standing over her. He was surprised by our intrusion, but began to resist. We quickly neutralized him and freed the woman. The woman we rescued said that her kidnapper was just one of many. She could hear them discussing other places where several other women were being held. It was a new challenge for us. We knew that every minute counted and immediately set out to find other victims. Our search led us to an abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. According to information, several women were kept there preparing for the next ritual. We prepared for a decisive operation, realizing that this might be our last chance to stop the cult. The night was quiet and oppressive as we surrounded the motel. We went inside, ready for anything. It was dark inside, and we could only hear soft voices from the other end of the corridor. When we got closer, we saw several women tied to beds, and several men in black robes were standing nearby. The robed men began to resist, but we acted quickly and decisively. After releasing the women, we detained all the participants of the ritual. It was a difficult and dangerous operation, but we were able to save a few more lives. The women were exhausted but alive, and this gave us new strength to fight. While searching the motel, we found an old diary belonging to one of the cult members. It contained details about their rituals and plans for the future. We realized that this was only the tip of the iceberg, and the real threat was still ahead. We knew we were approaching the final battle. The cult had a lot of resources and influential supporters, and we had to be ready for anything. We prepared an action plan and began gathering evidence to apprehend all those involved in these heinous crimes. We received information about a secret meeting of cult members that was supposed to take place in an abandoned castle on the edge of the city. This was their main gathering place, and we knew it was our last chance to stop them once and for all. We gathered all our strength and went to the castle. The night was dark and foggy, which added even more tension to the atmosphere. When we drove up to the castle, we saw that it was guarded by several armed men. It was a real den of evil. We split into groups and began to approach the castle from different directions. Every step was careful and considered. We knew we had no room for error. Bursting inside, we encountered stiff resistance. It was a real battle for life. After several hours of fighting, we were able to take control of the castle. Many of our men were wounded, but we achieved our goal. We arrested the cult leaders and freed several other women. It was a tough win, but we knew we made the right move. After the operation was over, we returned to our station feeling proud that we had been able to stop this horror. The women we rescued gradually returned to normal life. We continued the investigation, gathering evidence and preparing for the trial of the cult members. The investigation continued, and we learned more and more gruesome details about the cult's activities. It was a long and difficult road, but we did not stop. Every day brought new challenges, but we knew we had to continue to fight for truth and justice. Finally, the day of judgment came. The leaders of the cult were accused of numerous crimes, and a just punishment awaited them. We stood in the courtroom feeling proud of our work. It was a triumph of justice and proof that evil will always be defeated. After all that had happened, we could finally breathe a sigh of relief. We saved lives, stopped evil, and restored justice. This was our biggest victory. But we knew that it was our duty to always be ready for new challenges. Because the world needs those who are ready to fight for truth and goodness, despite all the difficulties. Despite the triumph in the courtroom, the shadows of the past continued to haunt me. Every time I closed my eyes, the creepy barn, the screams of the victims, and the cold stares of the cult members appeared in front of me again. Nightmares have become an integral part of my life, but I knew I couldn't let fear get the better of me. A few weeks after the trial, I received a strange letter. It had no signature, just a few lines that made my heart sink. "We're not done yet. The real game is just beginning." These words put a cold sweat on my back. Could it have been some kind of joke or something much more sinister? The letter made me plunge into a new investigation. I felt there was more to it than just trying to scare me. My heart was beating like crazy as I went back to the case files. Each page, each piece of evidence led me to the realization that the cult may not have completely disappeared. One evening on my way home, I noticed a black car following me. Its headlights glittered in the darkness like the eyes of a beast stalking its prey. I tried to remain calm, but in my heart I felt that something was wrong. It was like going back to the worst nightmares I've ever had. The next day I received another letter. It contained a map and directions to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. I knew it could be a trap, but I felt I had no choice. My curiosity and desire to find the truth outweighed my fear. Arriving at the factory, I felt a strange premonition. The place was abandoned and overgrown, but inside I found signs of fresh activity. Walking through the corridors, I felt my heart beating faster. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound like footsteps. I stopped, gun ready. A figure in a black cloak appeared in front of me. It was one of those we couldn't catch. His eyes glittered in the darkness, radiating sick joy. He said softly, "You think you've won? We're just getting started." His words hit my heart like a blade. The figure rushed at me and a fierce struggle began. Every blow, every movement was delivered with pain and despair. It was a battle not only for my life, but also for the truth I sought. In the end, I was able to neutralize him, but that was just the beginning. After this fight, I realized that I needed help. I turned to my colleague Emily, who has always been a reliable partner. She agreed to help me navigate this creepy maze. Together, we began to gather evidence and look for new clues. We went back to old crime scenes, hoping to find something we missed. Every corner, every detail could become the key to the solution. Our investigation once again led us to abandoned buildings and dark basements. Fear and tension became our constant companions. One evening, while looking through a cult member's diary, we found a mysterious code. They were sets of numbers and letters that didn't make any sense. We began to look for what this could mean, and eventually found a connection with the addresses of abandoned buildings in the city. It was a new discovery that could bring us closer to the truth. With the new data, we set out to find places that matched the code. Each address was another trap, but we couldn't stop. It was like hunting for shadows. They were always one step ahead, but we didn't give up. Once, arriving at the next place, we found something terrible. It was an abandoned kindergarten, inside which we found old toys and drawings on the walls. But the main thing is that we found traces of fresh activity. This place was used as a shelter for new victims. In the dark basement of the kindergarten, we found a tape with a recording. It was the voice of one of the cult leaders talking about a new ritual. His words made us shudder. The next victim has already been chosen. We will mark it with a great celebration. We realized that we have little time. We began a race against time to find the next victim and stop the ritual. Each new address, each new trail brought us closer to the goal. We could feel the fear and tension growing every day, but we couldn't afford to give up. Eventually, we found the place where the ritual was planned. It was an old theater, abandoned and neglected. We prepared for the final operation, realizing that this was our last chance. The night was dark and foggy, which added even more tension to the atmosphere. Bursting into the theater, we saw a scene that resembled a real nightmare. The victim lay on the altar, and around her stood members of the cult in black robes. They started the ritual, but we were ready to stop them. The fight began immediately, and each of us knew that this might be our last fight. During the fight, I met the cult leader again. who sent me letters. His eyes radiated cold rage and contempt. We threw ourselves at each other, and it was a real duel to the death. Every blow, every movement was filled with hatred and determination. In the end, I was able to neutralize the cult leader. His last words were full of malice and despair. "You think it's over? Well, be back." But I knew it was the end of him. We rescued the victim and arrested all those involved in the ritual. After the final operation, we returned to the station feeling relieved and tired. It was a long and difficult road, but we were able to stop the cult and save lives. However, the echo of horror continued to haunt me. I knew that I would not be able to forget those terrible moments for a long time. After the final surgery, I was filled with relief, but also exhaustion. My colleagues and I were finally able to rest a little and come to our senses after numerous and long battles. However, going back to normal was hard, especially after everything we had been through. Exposing and arresting members of the cult became only part of our work. We continued to study all possible connections and roots of their activity. Our team analyzed the materials collected during the operations to make sure we didn't miss anything important. Sometime after the arrests, we began to notice that the investigation did not produce the results we expected. There have been new reports and hints that the cult or its remnants may not only be local, but may also have international connections. One day, I received an invitation to a secret meeting with representatives of international law enforcement agencies. It turned out that the cult had an extensive network in other countries as well. We discussed possible connections and planned joint actions for further investigation. After the meeting, it was felt that the horrors were not over yet. Our new partners have reported a number of pending cases in Europe that may be related to our case. I had to prepare for new trips and investigations. I went to Europe with other detectives and experts from our team. We began investigations in several cities where the cults had their influential roots. It was a new struggle at a new level where we had to face completely new challenges. Our investigation in Europe led us to an old castle in Germany where it turned out that cults used the place for their meetings. Inside the castle, we found traces of terrible rituals and hints of new victims. After extensive investigations and gathering of evidence, we managed to establish contact with some informants who spoke about the new plans and goals of the cults. This allowed us to understand the scale of the threat and plan our next steps. During the investigation, we discovered that many high society people were involved in the cult's activities. It was a shocking discovery that jeopardized not only our investigation, but also our safety. We learned about numerous corruption schemes and conspiracies. Our efforts in Germany led to the organization of a large-scale operation to arrest persons involved in the cult. We conducted several successful raids and collected new evidence that confirmed international connections and scale of activity. International investigations revealed another layer of complexity. Some of our partners had their own interests, which made cooperation difficult. These internal conflicts and suspicions added tension and created new challenges. One day, while investigating new tracks, we came across a terrible revelation. It turned out that the cult was planning a series of attacks on civilian targets in different countries. It was part of their plan to create chaos and fear on a global level. Our team went to Switzerland, where we received information about possible warehouses of weapons and dangerous materials that the cults could use for their attacks. In Switzerland, we faced new obstacles and dangers, but our efforts began to bear fruit. We continued negotiations with representatives of various countries and organizations, trying to coordinate our actions and get support for new operations. The tension grew, and each day brought new challenges. In Switzerland, we found several warehouses where cults stored dangerous materials. Operations to defeat them were difficult and dangerous. We managed to neutralize part of the threat, but there was still a lot of work to do.